Also from my side, greetings to everybody. I'm really happy to see so many colleagues connected. It's a very important topic. I'll give you an introduction to why we as ICAT prepared this forest policy assessment guide and how it fits into the overall series of ICAT guides and transparency work in countries. So let me kick off by just sharing with you ICAT's broad vision on transparency, which really focuses on policies and actions, and that is the motivation for preparing these assessment guides. These are meant to support the translation of broad global objectives into the reality that actually makes a difference, to link goals that countries have set to action at the local level. So we can distinguish three categories of benefits that countries and other users can derive from these guides. The first one relates to effective policy design and implementation. So using sound data and information to create the policies that can actually translate targets into effective action, and then tracking that as implementation advances. Secondly, these guides can be used to engage the relevant stakeholders, and that means stakeholders in the forestry sector, in this case, but also those that are engaged in other sectors need to be connected, and those that are in charge of overall planning, and then to link the different levels of governance from the national down to the local. And thirdly, this is about accountability. So the possibility to report on action at the national level or through international reporting schemes like those of the UNFCCC internationally, and then to reach out to financiers, both public or private. So effectiveness, integration, and accountability are the key words that we want to highlight in the case of the use of this forestry assessment guide. Forestry is, as I said, a critically important aspect of overall climate policy. Together with agriculture and other land use, accounts for 25% of global emissions. Deforestation is a predominant source of emissions, but it's important to look at forests beyond that emissions aspect and also consider the forest as a carbon sink. And that's where clearly when we look at a global transformation towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions, forests will play a critical role in order to make that possible. And that's where forestation and sustainable forest management. So here you see those three aspects covered by the forest guide that we are launching today. The photos from the left to the right show a forestation project in Iran. On the left, a sustainable forest management project in Liberia. In the middle, and a project to reduce deforestation in Nigeria. And these are the three areas covered by the forestry guide, which provides methodology to assess the GHG impacts of policies that enable or incentivize an increase in carbon sequestration or a reduction in GHG emissions. That, of course, is closely linked to the Paris Agreement, which calls on countries to implement and support efforts to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and to foster conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. So one of the objectives of using the guide is to prepare for reporting under the Paris Agreement's reporting framework, which is the so-called enhanced transparency. Let me show here some of the linkages that can be made to that reporting framework. You see on this figure the main elements of this enhanced transparency framework, and highlighted with a red frame, you see those elements that can actually benefit from the application of the Forestry Assessment Guide. Let me start at the left-hand side. In light blue, there you see 4 categories of inputs to be prepared. The main purpose of applying the assessment guide really is to support countries in assessing policy impacts. And that's critical in complying with the requirements of the second of those reporting elements shown here on the left-hand side in light blue. So all the elements to report on the implementation of NDCs will benefit from an assessment of policies that can be done by application of them. But the guide can also be used for an assessment of resources needed for NDC implementation, and in that sense then feed into reporting of the support required, which is the third item from the top there on the left-hand side. All of this then feeds into the biannual transparency report, the so-called BTR, which is here at the center of the slide in dark blue. And then going further to the right, you can see a link to the technical expert review. This is where an ex post application of the assessment guide can be beneficial in evaluating the impact on GHG emissions that a certain policy has made or has not made. It's not been sufficiently successful. That's then when we link to the last element in gray on the very right, the updating of NDCs, where the assessment then can feed into a new policy cycle to improve effectiveness and also strengthen policy response in the forest sector. But I want to highlight that it's important to look beyond reporting. So transparency is, in our view, not only about greenhouse gas emissions, but also important in order to look at socioeconomic and environmental impacts and to link to finance. And just briefly expand on that. Transparency framework can help to actually link to national development priorities. If it's set up to provide data on economic growth, on job creation, on social and environmental aspects, for instance, biodiversity aspects that are critical for forest policy. When we think about transformational change, of course, mobilizing investment become a critical feature of successful implementation. There, convincing public and private finance institutions is a critical aspect. Again, if you have data on a good M&E framework, if that includes some economic data, then you are in a much better position to be able to speak to those finance institutions and to convince them that the setup is sound and promising. This is especially critical right now in a situation where many countries find themselves that they are in a crisis, in an economic crisis that has been sparked through the global pandemic, and where then redirecting or directing recovery finance in a way that stimulates the economy after the crisis is important. And we want to be able to show that spending for instance, forest policy is also a way that can have benefits for the economy. It can be part of a green recovery package. So these are aspects that are not directly covered by the assessment guide that we are launching here today, but they are part of the suite of assessment guides, and that's why I want to end, just to give you a glance of the overall series of ICAT assessment guides. You see here in dark blue the 8 impact assessment guides. On the left-hand side, the 5 guides that focus on greenhouse gas impacts, renewable energy, transport, forestry, agriculture, buildings, efficiency. In the middle, then you see the 3 guides that cover cross-cutting aspects, addressing sustainable development, what I've just been talking about, but also the potential of policies to achieve transformational change. And then the 3rd one covering the aggregation or integration into policies of action at non-state or subnational level. And then on the very right, in light blue, you see the 2 process guides covering stakeholder participation and technical review. What we recommend is an application of several guides in parallel. So you could use the forestry guide to estimate GHG impacts, combine it with the guide on transformational change to estimate that transformational potential of policies, and then link it to an assessment of sustainable development. And today, we will hear later on a presentation that actually shows a very nice application of combining several of the guides, also then linking to the important aspect of stakeholder participation and technical review. ICAT supports countries in building up the transparency framework so that they have the data that is needed, and then in conducting assessments like those that you will hear about today. Our approach is to prepare countries for effective policy processes domestically, which will then enable them also to fulfill their reporting requirements under the Paris Agreement. So I'm looking forward very much to connecting with you, with colleagues here on this webinar, and we can do that either during the question and answer session or subsequently. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Henning. And we will indeed jump right into it. We have Molly White from the GHG Management Institute up next. And as her presentation is just loading, I'll just highlight to everyone that you can visit either the ICAT website or the YouTube channel to look at the previous webinars on those cross-cutting assessment guides, so for non-state and subnational action and for sustainable development and transformational change. Okay, thank you, Molly.
Thank you, Josh. Just to check, can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear. And presentation.
Okay, great. Okay. Let me just, okay. Do you still see my main slide? Just to check before I get started.
Yes, you're on the main slide.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Josh. And thank you, Henning and colleagues calling in from various time zones. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. and this forest guide. Before I get started, I do want to recognize all the other people that developed this guide, both other co-leads at Vera and the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, as well as an expansive group of drafting team members, technical working group members, the people and projects that piloted this guide, and then also the ICAT Advisory Committee review members. So a lot of work. It's nice to see that this guide is out there now. I also want to acknowledge that this work was built upon previous work, and we developed this guide in particular to be consistent with the IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories, as well as WRI's policy and action standards. So as you're working through the guide, you'll notice some similarities and consistencies in that regard. As Henning mentioned, this guide has also been developed to be consistent with the approach in the agriculture guide. And then you'll notice as you're working through this guide, there are steps that are integrated with the process guide on stakeholder participation, which I think is particularly relevant for forestry and forest policies. So with that, I hope to give you here a bird's eye view of the guide. We only have a little bit of time on this webinar. There's obviously a lot of detail in this guidance, but hopefully this is a little taste, a little introduction to what the guide can help you do. So when to use this guide? This guide can be used before, during, or after policy making. So this is useful both in ex ante estimates and as well as ex post. And so what this can do is on the front end, it can support your decision making and your policy design by assessing the expected future impacts of a policy. And then on the other side, it can support your understanding of efficacy. So you'll even hear from colleagues later in this webinar how they did an assessment in both situations, both in ex ante and in ex post, midway through to see how the policy was performing. As Henning mentioned, it also can support your transparent reporting of impacts of policy. And then throughout, it's a learning and evaluation tool. So at any point in a policy lifespan, you can use an assessment to understand how the policy is performing and then to also inform maybe future policy design. So what is the purpose of this guide? Henning mentioned this, but I'll just repeat here because it is important, but the purpose is to assess the greenhouse gas impacts of forest policies that increase carbon sequestration and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by either enabling or incentivizing afforestation, reforestation, sustainable forest management, or reduce deforestation and degradation. So many of you on this webinar are probably fairly familiar with what those activities are, but so afforestation, reforestation are those policies that increase or restore vegetative cover through planting or human-assisted natural regen of trees. The sustainable forest management activities and policies are those things that increase biomass carbon stocks through improving forest management practices. And then reduce deforestation and degradation. These are those policies that might reduce conversion of forest lands with high carbon stocks to forest or non-forest lands with lower carbon stocks. And then on, sorry, I just have to minimize my panel here so I can see my slide. The guide, covers a range of policy instruments. So I've included on this slide just a few types of policy instruments. In the forest sector, what these look like might be things like some service agreements with landowners, or even things like training modules that are disseminated through extension agents for sustainable production of forest products, and and forest resources. So the overview, this method and this guide, it was divided up into 4 main parts. The first part is an introduction and goes through the objectives of your assessment and outlines the key concepts that the guide uses, and then starts to guide you through the things that you might want to think about when putting together an impact assessment for a forest policy. So this is the part where you will really determine the objectives of your assessment, and you'll base the assessment in the principles of transparency, accuracy, completeness, consistency. It's in this part that you'll first start to define the level of accuracy that you need for your assessment, and that's very much tied to the data availability you have for your policy. And resources you have available for assessing the policy. Then in part 2, this is a really interesting part where you define the assessment, and it's, I think, easy to think that you can skip this part. A lot of us on this webinar might want to go right immediately to assessing the greenhouse gas impact. But it's in this part that you clearly describe the policy or a package of policies that is being assessed. And chapter 6 in particular is a very important chapter, and some of the added benefits to doing a greenhouse gas impact assessment that Henning mentioned in his opening remarks happen in this chapter 6. So chapter 6 can be used to inform policy implementation. It's in this chapter that you identify and not only quantify certain things that are inputs to stakeholder identification, you'll identify all the impact inputs and activities of the policy, you'll begin to map a causal chain, and really define the boundaries of the assessment, both temporally or geographically. Then part 3, this is where the calculation and estimation happens. This is the component of the guide where you'll stratify land, you'll estimate land areas, estimate carbon stock change, define carbon pools. So this in a lot of ways will feel familiar if you've worked on greenhouse gas MRV in the forest sector for a while. Then the last chapter, part 4, this is the monitoring and reporting part of the guide. And this is where you'll identify key performance indicators and create a monitoring plan for indicators and parameters within your assessment. So rather than walk through all the steps in brief time here, I thought I'd highlight just 4 steps that I see as particularly not necessarily novel, but interesting and maybe of something new that you haven't used yet or are immediately familiar with. So the development of causal chain, ex-ante assessment of implementation potential, the emissions approach versus activity data approach, and monitoring performance over time. So developing the first here is developing a causal chain to identify greenhouse gas impacts. So I already kind of mentioned this, where it can seem pretty easy to want to have your policy identified and the assessment that you want to conduct, and immediately go to what is the greenhouse gas impact. The reality is on the ground, and as a matter of assessing an impact, there are a very wide range of inputs and administrative activities and intermediate effects that happen before that impact is achieved. It also is helpful to map out this causal chain, because then you can have some understanding and some evaluative ability to understand which activities contributed or were attributable to that greenhouse gas impact. So in the guide, we walk you through steps to identify what these inputs and administrative activities are. And these are typically either resources or activities related to the administration of resources. So things like contracts or enforcement policies, even hiring procedures. And then the intermediate effects are usually characterized as either being land-based or market-based. You'll see here, this is an example of a payment for ecosystem service causal chain. And the result in this mapping is having just a well-defined understanding of how these interim activities, and I should mention both intended and unintended, will increase or decrease your emissions within your assessment. You know, and at this point, you might find yourself being iterative, going back to part 1 and then going back into part 2. This mapping can also inform the boundaries of your assessment. You might decide at this point, you know, there's only a particular component of this causal chain that you can assess with a reasonable level of accuracy. So the second highlighted step for the guide that I wanted to go over is a concept of an emissions approach or an activity approach. This comes up in an ex-ante estimate. And the emissions approach is very much in, you know, in tradition to what, you know, a project level accounting approach, where you compare the greenhouse gas emissions and removals between the policy scenario and a baseline scenario, and then the difference between those is your impact. With this guide, we also wanted to include another approach, recognizing that many might not have either the time or the resources or other capacity components to do this this more rigorous approach. So we included what we call the activity data approach. And this approach focuses on estimating the effect of the policy on the activity data itself by estimating the expected increase or decrease in the area of land or in a land category. And in many ways, this has an implicit baseline embedded in it. But can be a little bit easier, especially in ex-ante when your data availability for, say, modeling a baseline might not be immediately readily available. The third highlight here is the assessment of the implementation potential. So this will, if you've used the WRI's policy and action standard, this will look very familiar. But this also comes up in an ex-ante estimate where the guide includes a really good set of questions that are scored to help you identify and define the policy design characteristics and national circumstances, and then the financial feasibility and any other barriers that might take your maximum implementation potential of your forest policy to a more rigorous and conservative estimate. And the guide includes, like I said, a really good prompting of a series of questions and helps you walk through some of the decision making that you need to be thinking about when putting together a policy assessment. These questions can also be useful during initial stakeholder engagement in the implementation phase of a policy. So I just point that out as a resource for people. And then finally, the fourth highlight here is just monitoring performance over time. Henning mentioned the importance of M&E and the importance that some on this call might have given the particular relevant circumstances in the international space as recovery plans are being developed and as NDCs are being updated nationally. This guide includes how to identify key performance indicators of a forest policy, and then has a comprehensive 4-page table of the 3 types of parameters that you can include in a monitoring plan. So if you are, you know, maybe your resources don't allow you to conduct a full assessment, but you're curious about what indicators and what parameters might be important for starting a monitoring plan for a policy, this would be a good chapter to pick up. So I think with that, Josh, I'll pass it back to you and welcome the other speakers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Molly, so much for that really insightful presentation. And I'm going to pass it on over to Ricardo now to wonderful. Good to bring you to Mexico.
Can you see my slide, my main slide?
We can, Ricardo, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jers. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Well, I want to talk to you about the Environmental Fund for Protection and Sustainable Development in Querétaro. So first, let me introduce my state a little bit. Querétaro is a state located in the central part of Mexico and has an area of 11,700 square kilometers. Only 0.6% of the country's surface. In recent years, we have designed a series of legal instruments that contribute to the management of climate change, as well to have a fund that is strong enough to help to reduce the greenhouse gases emissions. Many of that instruments are, for example, the State Environmental Protection Program, the State Climate Change Law, Environmental Protection and Sustainable Development Fund. That, but in special, I want to talk about the payment of environmental services, in which we have collaborated with the federal government to increase the ambitions of the National Forest of Commission programs in terms of GHG reductions and in terms of the ecological restoration of our landscape. For this purpose, I would also like to comment that we have reached these conclusions through several diagnoses, like, for example, this baseline of our economy, citizen service, emission inventories, and looking at the end, looking for the decarbonization pathways of our economy in our state. So we, since the beginning of this administration, we started to develop a plan, and we call it a State Development Plan. And we include an environment strategy that includes all that topics: territorial ecological planning, biodiversity protection, climate change strategies, air quality, integrated management, waste management, and clean water. In Querétaro and Mexico, we have polluted many rivers, streams, springs, entire basins, and we need to develop appropriate strategies against this environmental important program. So in Mexico, the budget of a subnational government is managed through a public document, which is published officially, and through this medium becomes mandatory for the officials of the different offices in the state government. We also have our tax law that authorizes environmental taxes and allocates money for environmental purposes. Mexico money, public money, cannot be used for anything other than what is stated in this specific document. This is established in the federal law or financial discipline. One of the most important projects in which we have allocated resources from Environmental Protection Fund is in payment for environmental service in collaboration with CONAFOR. We have developed during the last year our environmental fund operations rules that includes these three main strategies: procedures to access money for the citizens and organizations, increase the transparency in the use of the public money in environmental topics, and evaluate effectiveness of the results. All of this ordinance, economical ordinance, is in agreement with the environmental planning system. We start with the state development plan, then we developed the state environmental protection program, a climate change strategy, a waste management change strategy, an air quality management system, a biodiversity strategy, and many natural protected areas management plans. So CONAFOR allocates around $35 for each hectare, and the state doubles that amount. At the moment, in the rest of the states in Mexico, the owners of the property only receive the amount of the CONAFOR. And CONAFOR have a very strict operation rules according with the demonstration of the property of the land. CONAFOR allocates around $35, as I said before, and the state government doubles those amounts. In Mexico, it's very common that the landowners are not in order with the documentation that proves the property of the land. In the state government, we are more interested in demonstrating the effectiveness of the projects in terms of ecological regeneration, as well as greenhouse gases reduction. With the local tax money, we are not so strict with proving the property. And when we double the payment that CONAFOR makes, we ask for greater conservation results. So we demand, for example, the cattle to be removed from the farms that receive the state money. And over the last years, and from, for example, in this administration from 2018, we at the end have benefits for 13,991.63 hectares. And it represents about the reduction of 14,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. If we include 20,000 hectares, about we estimate that about a reduction about 48,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So the ICAT guidelines allow us to have a greater confidence in the estimation of the reduction of greenhouse gases emissions in Querétaro Forest, since we have received an external review that validates the data that we present as a result to our society of the collection of the environmental tax that we make them every year. So we are working with Grupo Ecológico Sierra Gorda, with CONAFOR, and we have used the guides from the ICAT guides, and we improve our and increase the certainty and the transparency in GHG emissions. Thank you for our colleagues to hear my presentation, and welcome to the other speakers.
Thanks, Ricardo, so much. I'm sure everybody online would have found that presentation incredibly helpful. We're switching now over to David. Yeah, who's going to bring you some insight onto the project also on the ground. Thanks, David.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Ricardo. I'm going to pick up where Ricardo left off and explain in more detail how we use the guidance of ICAT to assess the greenhouse gas impacts of the state of Querétaro's subnational action for the regeneration of forest using payments for ecosystem services. Okay, this is one component of a broader policy, a nationally appropriate mitigation action, a NAMA, that is called Subnational Mitigation Actions for the Regeneration of Landscapes. So it also, NAMA also includes, in addition to the regeneration of forests, the regeneration of grazing lands and the regeneration of croplands. The number of states that will be participating will be 12 states. The coordinating organization, which I'm advisor, is the Grupo Ecológico Sierra Gorda, which is based in the state of Querétaro. And the state of Querétaro is the founding state and is inviting the participation of the other states to scale up this activity at a national level. Partners in this NAMA include farmers, ranchers, forest owners, state governments, NGO partners in the different states, as well as federal ministries, including the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the National Commission for Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity. Okay. So we applied ICAT documents to evaluate the impacts of the entire NAMA, including the actions in each of the 12 participating states. And we decided to apply 6 ICAT guidance documents. First, the introductory guide to help us understand how to use all of these different guides in combination. And then we use 2 guides to evaluate the greenhouse gas impacts of the NAMA, the agriculture guide and the forestry guide. And then we also used the transformational change guide to evaluate the transformational change impacts of the NAMA, which includes a combination of greenhouse gas impacts and also sustainable development impacts. And regarding the supporting guidance documents, we decided to use the non-state and subnational action guidance documents in order to compare the greenhouse gas impacts of the NAMA with the nationally determined contribution goals of Mexico. And then we also decided to use the technical review guidance document as well, and decided to have an external technical review of these reports. Okay, so today in this webinar, I'm going to focus on the use of the forest guide, the assessment of greenhouse gas impacts of subnational actions for forest regeneration. Okay, the scope, we've already begun with these initial activities in the state of Querétaro, and one other state also had some early action activities. So we did an ex post evaluation of the activities already implemented to date when we did the assessment in those 2 states. And then we also did an ex ante evaluation of the impacts in 12 states looking to the future. And we did it through 2030, and we selected the year 2030 because that is the goal year for Mexico's NDCs under the Paris Agreement. So we wanted to focus and show how these different aspects of the NAMA can contribute to Mexico achieving its NDCs and hopefully to making the NDCs more ambitious. The guidance document of ICAT lays out different approaches that you can use in the use of the guidance documents, and we decided to use the key recommendations approach and implement each and every one of the key recommendations and document that. And then we also decided to have a third-party independent technical review from an organization that's completely independent of these activities. Okay, we did have extensive participation of stakeholders. We had a series of workshops and other events with stakeholders from different states, some of them in the state of Querétaro, in the Sierra Gorda, and then also we had a series of trips around the country to have meetings with stakeholders in different states to help us with this process of evaluation of the potential. Okay, and so the greenhouse gas impacts that were assessed were, one, the increase of carbon in live biomass via natural regeneration. So the capture of carbon in trees and their roots and in the understory. We decided to use the activity data method, which involves using activity data, which is in hectares, multiplied by greenhouse gas emission removal factors. Okay. The ICAT guidance document also has, which is we found very, very interesting and very useful, methods to determine the likely implementation potential for the policy. So it has a whole series of issues to consider about how effective it will be and what is the likely implementation potential. And in our case, we determined that the most limiting factor is money, is financing. And so we determined an estimate of implementation hectares per state in the future. And so that's for the ex-ante estimation, that is goal setting. And we established it as based on the experience in Querétaro and the other state. It was a goal that we believe is ambitious but reachable. And then also we considered a 10% reduction for risks such as fire, diseases, hurricanes, meaning that in some areas that receive payments for ecosystem services, there's still risk that even after they receive and with all the good intentions of landowners, some things can still happen which result in not capturing additional carbon. So we estimated successful implementation in 18,000 hectares per state in order to have a conservative estimate of the greenhouse gas impacts. Okay, there was a local study in the Sierra Gorda in oak forests that we use, and the Secretary of Sustainable Development, thank you very much, helped pay for that study so that we could improve the accuracy of the estimations and develop local emission factors. And we also extrapolated some of that information for other states. And then we also used emission factors from the most recent greenhouse gas inventory of Mexico that was reported to the UNFCCC. Okay, and then the results, and actually this is what Ricardo already showed. In the state of Querétaro, the ex-post estimate was 14,544 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And then looking forward to the future with a goal of 20,000 hectares, that can be approximately 48,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And then at the level of the entire NAMA in all 12 states, we did an estimate of the impact, 694,000 tons per year from 12 subnational actions. And then we use the other guidance document for non-state actions to compare that with the NDC goal of Mexico for the forestry sector. And it represents 5% of that goal. So that's significant. And it's also important to consider that this involves just those 12 subnational actions in 20,000 hectares or 18,000. and that the reorientation of the system of government programs, technical support, incentives, and financial mechanisms, which is also a component of the NAMA, is expected to result in greater impacts. And our vision is that this is just the beginning, that we want to scale up in order to obtain a transformational change of the forestry sector in Mexico. Okay, then, so we developed these reports, and then we had a third-party technical review in which the technical reviewers first received the reports and reviewed them, had a desk review comparing all of the key recommendations with our reports to confirm that we did them correctly, to check our calculations, to make sure that we did those correctly. And then they came to Mexico, had meetings with a national level meeting with the state, with federal ministries that were involved. Then they did a state level meeting with the Secretary of Sustainable Development of the state of Querétaro. And then they also came into the Sierra Gorda and met with the landowners themselves to get feedback in order to evaluate the accuracy of these reports. And the key conclusions were that the assessments followed and are consistent with the key recommendations of the ICAT guidance documents, and that the impact estimations are conservative, which is good because in the world of estimating carbon impacts, we want to have conservative estimations. It was also very useful because the external review, because they provided useful recommendations for the future, including more wide review of risk evaluations, to include more detailed financial feasibility analysis in all the areas in which the NAMA operates, and to continue to generate and use local emission factors. So in conclusion, we found the use of the ICAT forest guidance document to be very, very useful, as well as the others. Among the ways that we have used it, it helped us to improve the design of the policies. It has helped us to recruit other states and federal ministries to join us and be part of this effort. It is helping us to monitor and report the impacts of the NAMA. The states can use this information to report to the environmental ministry, which then takes that information into account for the NDCs of Mexico. And we are also using it to help support our fundraising efforts. Okay, with that, I'll stop here and we'll move on to the question and answer section.
Thank you very much, David. And I've got to say that's a highly perfect presentation because we're finishing right on as planned on the hour. I'm just going to bring the screen back to myself. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, wonderful. And apologies for must have been some issues at the beginning that you couldn't see my screen. Okay, and now you see my face. So I'd like to take this chance to say a really big thank you to all of the panelists and speakers today. So Henning, Molly, Ricardo, and David. And now we get to the fun part of the webinar, where we get to ask your questions and you get to hear the answers from these speakers. So in the dashboard on your right-hand side or on your left-hand side, wherever you've placed it, please enter in the question section any questions that you may have for the panelists. You can, in the section just below, you see the handouts. You can access and download either the guide, assessment guide for forestry, or the presentation for today. So in case you want to refer back to those two documents to pose your questions. So I will start with the first one, which is actually lifting off from with yourself, David, and it asks, did the use of the forest and other ICAT guidance documents help you improve the design of the NUM?
Yes, they did. They were very helpful in improving the policy design. Some examples were that it, through the process of evaluating both greenhouse gas impacts and the potential for transformational change, we incorporated a new specific objective for the regenerative orientation of the system of different government programs, technical support, incentives, and finance mechanisms for the forest sector as well as the agricultural sector. And then we also included a specific objective and activities for the formation of a critical mass of public officials, decision makers, NGOs, educators, technicians, and producers committed to regenerative management. We also decided to add a public awareness campaign to build public support for all these activities and build public states to these activities. And also the integrated landscape management orientation was a specific recommendation of the external reviewer. So there were numerous examples of how this whole process helped us improve the design of the policy.
Hey, Josh, we can't hear you.
Okay, thanks for that. Our next question is coming for Molly, and it's asking a bit more of a general question about what is the time frame of an impact assessment?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for that question. Yeah, you saw in David's presentation, he touched on the time frame that he used for both his ex ante and ex post assessment. In the guidance, there's, and I'll also say, David mentioned the key recommendations approach, and just to note for this audience, the guide is developed with a series of key recommendations that are throughout, and then steps underneath those. So that's just a structural outline of how the guidance operates. But as it relates to time period, the time frame or date that is directly specified in the policy can be used. So that could be the target end date or the goal end date. We've seen other policies use the extent of time that for which the policy will be funded. So a lot of times it's those financial resources that are a natural fit for what time period your assessment should run. And then just in general, the guide outlines that, in terms of best practice, it's good to use at least a 20-year assessment period for forest policies, just that IPCC outlines a 20-year transition period for soil carbon pools. And approximately a similar time period for harvest cycles of forests. So depending on your policy, that would be best practice. That said, extending much beyond a 20-year assessment, especially an ex ante, your baseline conditions and your implementation conditions might become more uncertain the more, the further out you forecast beyond 20 years. So in the guide, we kind of walk you through conducting, if resources are available, conducting multiple kind of discrete assessments so that you can course correct some of the assumptions, maybe some of the activity data that you're using in the assessment as you move from time period to time period. Thanks.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks for the question to the colleague online. Our next one is actually still with you, Molly, and it's asking if you include any analysis of soil carbon in the assessment for improved forest practices, reforestation projects, etc. So,
yeah, the answer is yes. So yeah, thanks for the question. The answer is yes, and in part two, when you're putting together your causal chain, there's a series of checklists that can help you identify the significant carbon pools that will be affected as a result of your policy. And those steps also help you walk through both the magnitude and the likelihood of those pools being affected. So yeah, thanks.
David, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, in our case, in the forest evaluation, we did not include soil capture, but in the other parts of the NAMA, the agriculture, I mean, that was the primary emphasis and very significant and very important.
Okay. Okay, our next question is for Ricardo, if you're still with us there. And our colleague is asking if the use of the ICAT guidance documents help you increase the relationship with the government, but also from the government with the Grupo Ecológico, Sierra Gorda, and the NAMA.
Yes, thank you for the question. The answer is yes, because it gives us more certainty about the using of public money, and we conduct this money for the correct purpose. When we established the tax in our tax law, we were thinking compensation of the emissions from the city emissions for the citizens. We asked for all the car owners about $5 every year as a tax, environmental tax, carbon tax. So when we use the guides, we give more certainty about the emission reduction and more confidence with the people, with the citizens, to report these reductions, because we have external review, and that gave us more confidence with the numbers that we were managing about the reductions. Sorry, Josh, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. I'm going to stay with you to group the questions that have come in. And it's a bit of a connecting question, which is, did the use of the ICAT guidance increase the confidence of the citizens in the use of public money?
Yeah, most people are happy to know that they specifically make financial support for initiative climate change. However, some academics and specialists often question the decisions by the government on these important issues. So to have the support of the guidelines and external reviewers offers us a better data to share with them. And once this type of citizens, this kind of citizens supports our initiative for that tax law, in generally that their opinion improves the citizens, normal citizens and common citizens regarding our public policy.
Thanks, Ricardo.
Unmuted.
Thanks, Ricardo. And thanks, Beth, for unmuting me as well. We've got a question based on that David mentioned the key recommendations approach. So maybe it could be both for David and for Molly. What does the key recommendations approach mean?
Well, the version of the ICAT guidance document that we used I think this actually might have been in the introductory guidance document. It's very flexible. And that's something that we really liked about the ICAT guidance documents. It says that you can take an approach of using all of the key recommendations, all of the questions and information that presented, or it also gives you an option if you have more limited objectives for the evaluation that you can use selected key recommendations. But you always should explain why your choice of why you are using some or why you are using all of them. And so we decided to use all of them because we had pretty broad objectives for this evaluation. So that we choose to use all of them and then also to have an external review of all of them. Molly, do you want to add to that? Your audio.
Oh goodness. Yeah, I was just going to add that yeah, so in the forest guide, the key recommendations are in italics. And David brings up a good point that the guide isn't it's not a very really prescriptive. What the guide really tries to do is help you evaluate what is the best situation for your assessment objectives, and then from there gives you key recommendations that you should incorporate into your assessment. And David, you also mentioned the reporting chapter. So very key to using this guide is the documentation and transparent reporting of all of those steps that you've chosen to include or not include, things that you estimated, things you based on expert judgment, the steps that you conducted along the way from processing your activity data to, actually calculating estimates. So very, very important in the use of this guide when you get your final impact assessment that the reporting is done in a way that somebody could pick up your report and understand what you did include and did not include.
And Josh, your audio.
I might just keep that on now, I think, for future questions. Our next question is with you, Molly, and it's asking, or in reference to the policy design characteristics and the types of questions you mentioned that reduce the implementation potential. So what are the types of questions?
Okay, yeah, I think, so in the, this is kind of that last highlighted chart I showed where in ex ante estimate, you're reducing your maximum policy implementation potential to something that is more conservative based on actual circumstances. And I should just note the implementation potential could be expanded as well, as if you went through this process and realized you actually had activities and drivers that expanded that potential, it could have that effect. But some of the policy design questions, so charts, the steps include things like institutional arrangements and national circumstances. So we ask the user to think about, did the stakeholders have, what benefits are they receiving from the policy? Do they have clear land title or clear rights that might influence the uptake of the policy? It's things like the participation requirements. So of the policy, so whether that's voluntary or regulatory participation. If the policy is being, if it is a compliance mechanism, how and to what extent is it being enforced? And then, linking to SDGs, what are the complementary synergies? So, is the forest policy going to, say, improve food security or other ecosystem services? A common one in forestry is water access. And then just, any policy implementation risks. So if you're familiar with project level accounting, a lot of times this gets called, the permanence of a action on the ground or an activity on the ground. In this guide, we use the implementation risk to understand, things like natural events or disasters to get a more conservative, realistic estimate. So I hope that helps. There is, I can try and find the page that chart is on, and so I'll just put it in the chat here, so that you can look at the full list of questions to ask during that part of the guidance.
Thank you, Molly. And thanks for the question again from our colleague online. And we've got a few more minutes, so please submit your questions as they come. Our next one is, our colleague is asking to have an idea about how we can implement reforestation in a barren land, as only little area of fertile land is available with them in that location. And it's mostly being exploited for agricultural purposes and using fertilizers. So any idea how to implement reforestation programs in a barren land? And who do you think could just perhaps start with that question?
Well, I could start, and I can comment that the Grupo Ecológico Sierra Gorda for many years gave us a strong emphasis to reforestation, and that can still be an important strategy. But the Grupo Ecológico Sierra Gorda has moved away from that idea towards natural regeneration. Because they have found that to be much more successful. Reforestation with one or just a few species is very vulnerable to plagues and pests, and there were some significant losses of reforestation due to those types of risks, where we have found that where there are areas that are degraded, but there are still enough trees that once you remove the degradation forces, such as cattle degrading or illegal logging, you remove those degradation forces, that natural regeneration with very diverse species has turned out to work much better and to capture much more carbon. And so that is the way that we have been moving.
Yeah, I'll follow David. Yeah, that it would really depend on maybe the person that asked this question could share a little bit more with follow-up after this webinar, but really depends on the site, obviously. But the a couple policies that we reviewed and have seen also, along with what David said in terms of having key, say, mother trees or basic seedlings that go in. Removing, if the land's barren, there's clearly disturbance pressures in the past of some kind, and just, kind of outlining a policy that would prevent those in the future. But the other thing I would just add too is the security of water. So we looked at a number of forest policies that include kind of conservation of water towers and key watershed areas that can, as countries experience some of the pressures of climate change, lands that have been degraded can often be also experiencing this water availability pressure.
Okay, thanks for both of your input on that question. And to our questioner online, if you do have follow-up questions to that, please email us at icat@unops.org. The email address, again, will be on the final slide here. And we can follow up with this discussion and also put you in touch with any of the speakers, of course. Our next question is going to be calling on David and Ricardo, and it's how did you secure the risks for forestry investments to be made for 20 years or more? And our questioner would like to ask how you manage this in the state of Querétaro.
I'll let Ricardo start with the answer because it involves the integration of the policy into different state laws and programs. Ricardo?
Yes. One of the strategies in the government is that it was at the Congress decision. It was in many laws that are in the same way structured, and we have on one hand the tax law, the budget of the state that is published in an official publication that is mandatory, and at the end in the climate change law and the environmental protection law. It gives us more certainty about the continuity of the policy, because it's not an administration decision, it's not the decision from a governor that it's only for 6 years in the position. So I think the way to establish a policy like that is using the Congress and put it in many different laws. And the end, on the other hand, I can say that using these transparency guides increase the confidence of the people, and the people after the years, after the time, ask for the continuity of that kind of policies.
And I would add that based upon that experience in Querétaro, when together we have been inviting the participation of other states, we are recommending that they also do the same, that they incorporate these financing mechanisms and policies into their different laws and programs, including climate change program and sustainable development program. And another recommendation that we make is that we encourage states to always have civil society, non-government organization partners. So these programs are not just seen as belonging to just one administration or one political party, but they're something that belongs to the people.
Okay. Thank you again to the both of you. Our next question is for Ricardo. It has a bit of context, and it goes, planting trees as a climate change mitigation action is becoming increasingly popular in the popular press, and numerous NGOs have begun to request donations to plant trees in numerous places around the world. So Ricardo, I would ask if you have been approached by an international reforestation NGO to explore partnerships to receive donations by those organizations, and whether or not this would potentially reduce Mexico's ability to claim carbon credits for its own NDC goals. Question mark after that. So, have you been approached by an international reforestation NGO in regards to partnerships, donations, and what would the impact be on claiming carbon credits for your NDC goals? Are you there, Ricardo? Okay, I do see actually Ricardo has somehow been dropped from the call. So,
Josh, I could add to the last part of that question. Those are part of the things that still have to be defined in the carbon markets. It is when an international organization or funder is funding an activity that is resulting in reduced emissions or increased capture, how is that going to be accounted for? It will be accounted for in the country in which is being captured, or whether it would be accounted for in the country that is financing it. So those are some issues that are pending definition.
okay. Thanks for that, Chip and David. And for our questioner online, we will provide the answer to this for you. We will follow up with Ricardo and include it in the send out with the Q&As. I think we have time for one more question, and it's still with you, David. And it's a nice question to wrap up. Is do you plan to continue to use the ICAT assessment guides for the assessment of future projects or impacts?
Yes. So the NAMA is now scaling up, and based upon our work with the application of this guidance documents, we developed a annual reporting format for the states to use to report information about their activities, so that can be used to estimate the greenhouse gas impacts ex post. And then that information can be used by the states to report to the National Environmental Ministry. The National Environmental Ministry is developing, in collaboration with ICAT, an online system for states, for subnational actors, to report their actions. And so the states, using this information developed with the help of the ICAT guidance documents, will be able to estimate their impacts and then report that to the national government. And the national government will be able to take that into account for the setting of new goals for the NDCs and reporting their advances.
Okay. Well, I wish you all the best for those ventures then as well, David. So, that's all we have time for. So I would like to start to wrap up, and with those speakers you see on the screen, express a really deep appreciation for donating your time and your expertise and your experience, and for some wonderful presentations and answers. I'd also like to say thank you to everyone who's still online for joining as well. I hope you found this webinar useful and helpful in assessing your policies and actions in the forestry sector. I'd also like to highlight to everyone, it might not be of interest, but if so, the next two webinars coming up on renewable energy and transport pricing are on your screen. Please register via climateactiontransparency.org. And I'd like to then say thank you very much. Please visit our website at climatetransparency.org, or follow us on Twitter. And you can also find us on YouTube, where the recordings of these webinars are also online. So with that, thank you so much again, and I hope you can join us in next week's webinar as well. But if not, good luck with applying the ICAT assessment guides, and please contact ICAT anytime you need. So thank you very much, and have a lovely afternoon and morning too.